Okay, so the final topic I wanted to cover in the lecture was to build upon the radio power consumption theme that I had uh, 2 lectures ago, and kind of look at what happens at the network level. And just as a reminder, we won't have the next 2 lectures, and then next week, Thursday, we are going to start with the remaining paper presentations. So this, you might recall the slide, which is that radios have sort of a 3 different places where power gets consumed. There is electronics on either side, so that's 2, and then the actual amplifier on the sender. And a point I had made was that the relative power consumption of these kind of matters quite a bit. In case of long distance radios, what do you think would dominate? No, everything is radio, right? So the RF power dominates, okay, but and therefore sending is more expensive. And in that case, what kind of power management is most effective? So you basically have 2 strategies, right? Shut things down or scale things so that they just take the right amount of time. So no, not turning off. So when the transmit power is high, then your strategy is to slow things down, because when you slow things down, then to send the same bit you need less energy. Okay, it's kind of the counterpart on the processor side. On the other hand, when you are in a regime where electronic power dominates, and that happens when you are in short range, because then the RF, we don't need to supply a lot of RF power. In that case, we switch to a shutdown mechanism. So you might recall we had the slide where there was a curve which had a sort of a bottom, which had a minimum, and to the left of that minimum, we were dominated by the RF power. To the right of that, we were dominated by the electric power, and on the right hand side, therefore your better strategy was to shut down, because if you slowed things down more, then in effect you are keeping the electronics on for a longer period of time. So for short range radios, in the extreme, what may end up happening is that this guy dominates the receiver side, just because the receiver electronics generally tends to be more complicated. So what this stuff has resulted in is, in recent years, like the last decade or so, kind of revisiting some of the ways radios were power managed. So if you kind of look at pre-short range radio era, radio management was basically a matter of managing this power. And the best trick that we knew was to play with the rate at which we are sending. So kind of all these things like capacity of a channel and things like that, they're all fundamentally boiled down to is that your signal to noise ratio affects the capacity of the channel, and namely the rate at which you're going to be able to send information. And therefore, if you have more time, then you can send it at a slower rate, and accordingly you would need less energy per bit. So there are very magical kind of numbers. If you do a communication class, they call it EB over N naught. N naught is the noise, EB is the energy per bit, and basically if you are communicating slowly, then you need on a per bit basis lower amount of energy, not this power, energy is lower. So so that's the thing. But once we are in this regime where this right hand side dominates, then a lot of those assumptions sort of fall out of the window. In particular, no longer could you say that, okay, I can keep the receiver up all the time waiting for a packet to arrive, because the act of keeping the receiver up was kind of the dominating thing. Now, in some cases, there is no choice. Okay, if you have a short range link and you are, I don't know, streaming audio or stuff like that, like let's say our Bluetooth headpiece, earphones and things like that, no choice. But in many applications, the traffic is pretty sporadic. It comes once in a blue moon, and in that case, you have an option of actually doing the shutdown and then kind of optimizing for the power on the receive side. So what this leads to is a general concept which relates very closely to shutdown. And while I'm going to talk about it in context of radios, but it's really applicable at all levels, okay, all levels of the system. And this is a term I'm sure you've heard of called duty cycling. So what duty cycling basically refers to is a system which is not operating continuously, but rather is operating, so you can think of it as a special case of shutdown where we operate in a periodic fashion. The period can change, but very slowly. So for practical purposes, you can say I'm operating on a, at least on short to medium term timescales. I'm operating on a periodic basis, and during that each period I bring the system up or a subsystem up for some short period of time and then put it back to sleep. So that's what it kind of looks like. So you might imagine, for example, I may have a sensor node observing something in the environment, let's say whatever, looking for people entering into the room or things like that. And then what it might do is, since we don't enter all the time, so it will sleep and then wake up periodically. And kind of the idea is that as long as my period is short enough that I still get to look at the target which I'm interested in capturing. So when a person passes by or a car passes by, there's a period of time during which it's still going to be in my field of view. So as long as I wake up, as long as the node wakes up once during that field of view, I'm okay. So that's that can decide your period. How long you are up during that depends upon what task you are doing. So in my example, you would need to be up sufficiently long so that you can capture enough samples from your actual sensor, the actual transducer, process it, stuff like that. So the period, as I mentioned, in part is decided by how long things are in observation. What else do you think can constrain the period? So in the same example, latency, right? So application would have some latency requirement. Application says, look, that you have to send me the event within a millisecond or whatever. Then in this scenario, I will not be able to do it. So there are two constraining factors. There is latency, and there is the how long would be, what is the dwell time of the target, I guess, for lack of a better term in this example. So both of these factors sort of come into play. So that's the duty cycling idea, and in very simplistic terms. So if you look at duty cycle, within each frame, we have an active period, we have a sleep period, and the percentage duty cycle refers to how long the system is active divided by the total time, so sleep plus active time. And the notion is that these applications with this duty cycle, from an application perspective, can be quite small, okay? So that would mean where latency is somewhat relaxed, okay? It's okay if it takes some time to respond, and also the latency, from a latency perspective, okay, and the application is such that we are not going to miss doing the task because of this. So that's kind of the idea. So let's look at this duty cycling a little bit more. So what happens, so as you can imagine that as the duty cycle percentage goes up, intuitively speaking, the quality of sensing is going to go up, or quality with which you are doing the application. So for example, the probability of detecting the event, so if my duty cycle goes up, less chance that I'm going to miss that target going by. It could be also number of data samples that I'm collecting. It could also be classification accuracy. A whole bunch of application level metrics generally relate positively to the duty cycle. So the higher the duty cycle, better the performance of the application. So that's the tension that you end up with. And now if you think in terms of that, given a particular duty cycle, I can translate that into something about into some measure of the overall system performance. So C, so just to get the jargon straight, C is the active time and P is the period. Okay. So what you can now imagine is that the permissible C and P, which basically collectively define the duty cycle, in turn are going to be dependent upon, that there is going to be some constraint that will follow. So I'll usually have some lifetime constraint, in the sense I'm a battery operated device and I need it to last for some certain period of time. The ratio or the values of the active power and the sleep power are going to matter. So for example, if sleep power is very high, then essentially that's my kind of baseline, and that will affect my lifetime. Or alternatively, for a given lifetime, it will affect the duty cycle I'm going to be able to achieve. So what the active power is, what the sleep power is, what the lifetime is, how much energy I started out with, the battery, and then finally what the application constraints are. All of these things together make result in some feasible set of sleep and period and active uptime that we are going to be able to sustain. Note how, while normally we refer to duty cycle in terms of percentages, in reality it is better to think of it as these two numbers, because 1 second out of 100 seconds is very different from 1 hour out of 100 hour, even though they are the same percentage duty cycle. So usually we kind of tease these two things separately. So now what ends up happening is that in a system like this, so usually, application quality of service requirements are going to be given to you. PA, PS, namely the active power and sleep mode power, these are going to be they're going to relate to your particular hardware platform. E is the battery with its non-idealities and all. So we kind of, as you might imagine, we kind of saw earlier in the course that battery may get affected by also this active and sleep time. Like for example, you might think of the sleep time as the time during which the device is getting to relax, the battery is getting to relax. Lifetime is going to be our requirement, how long we need to last. So that's kind of the idea. So now in reality what ends up happening is that there are some uncertainties about a lot of these things. So like for example, PA and PS, they could come from data sheet, but in reality, the actual device, these numbers are not necessarily what the data sheet said. There is a huge variations within that. We had, in one of the lectures, I talked about that, how electronics exhibit a fair bit of variation in various characteristics. Like you buy a bunch of identical chips, they are not going to be the same. There could be significant variation, and particularly when it comes to sleep mode power, variation could be maybe like 10x, 50x, things like that. It could be quite large. It's also affected by, let's say, temperature. So I may have same device, I deployed it indoor and I deployed it outdoor. Identical model, identical device, even if their electronics were identical, just because I have deployed them under different conditions, they would differ. So PA and PS may differ. Environmental conditions are different. Batteries, same thing. They, because of the age and all, going to differ as well. And then finally, application service quality requirements also change. So what all of that results in then is that of the C and P that we decide are usually not fixed. So you could operate it that way, but then you are either going to miss out on performance, or you are going to be conservative in the sense that you may leave energy unutilized. So one thing to think about also is that how these systems are often managed. So let's say you're running a network of 1,000 sensors in this building. It's not going to be the case that whenever a sensor is running out of the battery, then it is going to send you an event and you're going to replace the battery just of that, because a visit by someone to fix a sensor is very costly. So usually these things are done in a fashion where you go on a maintenance route and then you update everything. Okay, it's just going to be the cost of logistics. So in situations like that, also it's good to have something predictable about the performance. So, and the other thing is that also you would like to gain in performance if you can. Okay, so adapting duty cycle turns out to be kind of a strategy which gets used. There are other places where, like for example, I refer to battery, but instead of battery, I may have a harvesting system, and then depending upon how much energy in that location I'm happening to harvest, I can adapt the duty cycle frequency to match that, so that I get a sensor operating at maximum performance. So duty cycle can therefore be adapted. Now, in some operating systems, some embedded operating systems, they have a direct support for a duty cycling kind of abstraction. So for example, an OS called Contiki is very widely used when it comes to Internet of Things kind of stuff. And there they have this notion that I can tell the OS that here is this function and you should run it every so often. So there is basically you can declare a cyclic function. So that's kind of a notion for duty cycling. And then whenever there's nothing to run, the OS puts the system to sleep. In other cases, you can kind of fake it. So like, for example, if you're running on Linux, you would basically arrange for the system to go to sleep. And when it wakes up, you are going to execute your function. And then again, you're going to make a call to sleep. So there are many different ways you can realize a duty cycling thing. Usually what happens in these things is that the system goes to sleep, the timer fires, the interrupt from the timer is what kind of wakes up. So deep inside the processor, there's going to be some instruction along the lines of wait for an interrupt. Okay, so when it comes to implementing this duty cycling, what's now happening is that there are in a single application case, things tend to be simpler, but in general, what's going to happen is there are going to be many different applications running on the platform. They're all going to impose their requirements in terms of duty cycling. So the OS will have to somehow kind of aggregate them into a single schedule and do things. Now, when it comes to adaptation, this is where, again, the scheduler inside the OS will have to handle it. So for example, through other sensors, it may measure how much power is actually being consumed. So like, for example, the project you guys are doing with Odroid, you might imagine that depending upon the actual power consumption of this particular platform, because it depends upon temperature and things like that, you might want to let the duty cycle be maximized. So your goal could be, I want to run this application such that it lasts for a year. And then the optimization would be that based upon the actual power consumption, I'm going to select a duty cycle so that the platform lasts for a year and maximizes the work done. Because alternatives are, if you have a fixed duty cycle, then it could be that at the 9-month point your sensor dies, or it could be that at the end of the year it left a lot of battery unutilized when it could have actually performed better. So you want to hit your target just about right. So concept then becomes that all these variations which exist in the platform, somehow you sort of measure them, the actual power consumption, battery status, things like that, and then use them to adjust the duty cycle continuously. So there are operating systems which support this kind of variation concept. So one notion, for example, is that the tasks now tell the operating system something about the flexibility. So they may say, instead of giving a fixed period, they might give a variation in the period. So they may say period anywhere from 1 second to 5 seconds is acceptable. Of course, 1 second would be better than 5 seconds, but you have that flexibility. So you could imagine a task given that. Another possibility is the task may specify the uptime differently, so the activity time. So for example, it could be that some algorithm may say run at least I-min iterations of the of a computation, but if you do better, you can go to Imax. So you can give a range of computation, or you can imagine other ways. I can give the operating system a bunch of different functions corresponding to different quality, and then depending upon how much time the OS can give to me, it will select one of them. So there are many different ways this adaptation could potentially be done. So this leads to this notion that my tasks are adaptable. They basically, some way, they are specifying an allowable duty cycle, and then what the kernel is doing is it's basically adapting the duty cycle either by adapting the period or by adapting how much work the task gets to do during a period, so that based upon the actual conditions of the hardware, the power and the temperature and things like that, we basically just hit the goal, right? Okay, so just the right amount of maximize the quality while meeting the lifetime, or maximize the lifetime while meeting a quality requirement, or some combination thereof. Now, in particular, you can imagine applying this thing to, let's say, the radios. So in case of the radios, it would directly correspond to how much data you are able to send. So maybe you're collecting samples and your job is to ship them out. And the more the measurements you can take, or equivalently higher rate at which you can take the measurement, the better off you are. So for example, if my radio wakes up every second for 10 milliseconds, then I am only able to send 10 millisecond worth of data. Now, if I adapt that, then so typically what will happen is my sensors will collect the data at a periodic rate, let's say, for 1 second. They're going to buffer them up into some area of memory. The rest of the system wakes up, does a DMA, pushes it to a radio, and things go out. So, so it directly affects the rate at which I'm sampling, and therefore directly affects the rate at which I'm going to be able to whatever quality of the model I'm getting, or the quality of classification or control or whatnot. So typically these kind of systems, the way they would then operate is that they wake up once in a while, and when they wake up, they collect some samples from the environment, and then they process it. And if there is something interesting, then they are going to send an event report out. If there is nothing happening, then no event report goes out. So in this case, the duty cycle is going to be sized so that your probability of a missed event is low. Number of samples that you collect has to be enough so that you can get a reliable decision. For example, if I just collect, let's say it's about detecting a moving target. If I just collect 1 or 2 observations, then the probability of correct detection is going to be low. But if I collect more samples, I would have more accurate inferencing going on. So all these parameters come into play, but at the end of it, what's happening is that there is a rare event going out. So from a purely application perspective, all I want to do is I have some receiver or rest of the network, and all I want to do is to send a rare event out. Now that's very hard to do in a networking sense, because if it's a rare event, what should the receiver do? So the receiver can stay up all the time, but then as we just sort of started out with the premise that in short range things, receiving is expensive. So what we would like to achieve is the following kind of scenario, that my nodes are all asleep, some rare event happens, and then the event somehow goes through. Okay, but the nodes are asleep, so they need to be woken up. Now, obviously, this cannot be done in the sense if something is truly asleep, then it cannot communicate, and if it cannot communicate, I cannot send it a message to wake it up. So I have to somehow fake this process. Now, there are several ways you could approximate this thing. One is that perhaps it has some sort of a lower power radio, often called as wake-up radio, and it continuously listens on that, and then when it sees something there, then it wakes up the main radio. But usually that strategy doesn't work out very well, because we're talking about short range stuff. They're anyway low power radio, so there's not a whole lot of headroom remaining in that process. Other issues that come up is that usually these wake-up radios work by monitoring energy in the spectrum. So they say, is there some message going on? If so, some RF energy, and I'm going to wake up. The problem is that there are often spurious RF energy, so you kind of keep waking up falsely, and that kind of negates the purpose. So it's a complicated thing. So the alternative is to fake this thing via protocol. So what's happening then is, so now imagine, so let's try to kind of do a notional design. So let's imagine I have radios at either end of a link, and what these radios are doing is they are waking up periodically. So node A and B, A wakes up periodically to listen if there is a message for it. So these are the receivers waking up, and then at some point in time, which is indicated out here, A detects a rare event, and now A wishes to send it. So at A, the packet became ready at this time. The problem is B is not up. So somehow I need to, so I cannot have these two nodes duty cycling in a free way, okay? Because if A and B were asynchronously duty cycling, then whenever I'm sending the packet, obviously this guy is not up. So something needs to be done. So ideas? What can we do? Remember, the problem is that two of us, we are both sleeping on our own merry schedule. When I'm up, you are asleep. When you are up, I'm asleep. and at some point in time I have to send you a packet. So what can I do for it?
Shouldn't we sleep at the exact same time then?
Okay, so we sleep at exactly same time. That's one possibility. Huh? What does that mean? But I don't know when you're going to be up. But it was asleep, it cannot receive it.
The sender keeps waking up for a longer time.
Right. So basically there are fundamentally two strategies, right? One is we somehow arrange that we go to sleep and wake up at the same time, so these peaks are aligned. And the other alternative is that it's kind of like I call your phone, and if I suspect you're going, so I let the phone ring, right, until you are up. So if I know that you are going to be checking your phone every minute, then I'm going to let the ringing go on for a minute. Okay, so I have to kind of fake the equivalent of that. Okay, and there are many ways you could imagine doing it. So one very common way is the following: packets at the beginning of the packet, they have a preamble, and that preamble is used by the receiver to lock onto the signal to basically figure out what frequency you are transmitting the bits at, and then match that. So what A could do is, in a sense, it could create this preamble to be longer than the duty cycle interval, so that we are guaranteed that B will wake up sometime during this time. Okay, so in this example, at point in time the rare event became available, I start sending the packet, but what I do is I size the preamble to be longer than the duty cycle period, so that B is going to wake up during that time, and then B will wait for the preamble to finish, and then the payload follows that. Okay, so that's kind of the concept out here. So you can think of this preamble as a ringtone, and I'm just basically saying I'm going to guarantee that the ringtone is long enough. Okay. Question?
You have like external sensor for the received data attached to another pin. If there is something sent, I can wake up the RF now. The radio.
Say it again.
If I have a sensor to detect some signal is sent, something like that. So
So what does the sensor detect?
Detect that something is sent.
How does it? Isn't that a radio?
I think it will be a simplified version. It doesn't need to do decoding and encoding. It's only detecting.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So what you're saying is I can have something which only detects for RF energy. Okay. The problem is there are all sort of sources of RF energy. Okay. So that can falsely wake you up. So what you are describing is what I was talking a few moments ago, which is the wake up radio concept. So the very simple wake up radio, all they do is they monitor the RF band where you expect a transmission, and the moment they see RF energy, they say, aha, someone is trying to send something, I'm going to wake up. The problem is there is too much spurious RF stuff, because particularly remember, a lot of these things are operating in unlicensed bands. Your microwave oven starts, bang, all the sensors are going to wake up. You don't want that.
We can make it more complex until it takes the ID value.
Well, yeah, the thing is, the way the radios work is, either you're detecting something or you're detecting just energy. Okay, the moment you're saying I'm going to detect an ID, you basically have to have a demodulator and stuff like that. You could have a simpler one, but you'll have to have something. Okay, so yeah, I mean, all these obvious combinations unfortunately kind of run into these problems, that either you are going to be having a complex radio or you're going to be waking up falsely a lot. So this strategy is one approach. Now it still requires A and B to know something about each other. They need to know the period. Okay, and in particular, because A has to have the knowledge of this, what I'm calling this P sub pole, namely the duty cycling period of B. Now that sounds easy. The problem is that these are ultimately coming from clocks. So you also have to make sure that what A thinks of T pole in terms of its clock is what B thought of T pole. Okay, that is the both parties notion of T pole matches, which means another way of saying is our crystals or whatever source of time in the two cases should be close in frequency, because if they are not, then over time the notion of T sub pole is going to be very different in the two places. So this is one approach. Okay, you can imagine a variant of this where instead of sending a long preamble, what I do is I send the same packet with a short preamble repeatedly. So what's happening now is, in this case, I'm sending a train of identical packets. So packet repeated until such time that B actually is able to detect an entire packet. So what will happen in this case is that B will miss the first packet entirely. B will wake up in the middle of the second packet, but it will see junk because it woke up in the middle, won't be able to synchronize. But then the third packet it would be able to receive entirely, and then B will go back to sleep. And then, whereas this guy will still send the fourth packet because it's going to send a long enough packet train. There is a slight adaptation to it, you can imagine, where what A does is, after every packet, it listens for a bit for an acknowledgement. So in that case, what will happen is, the moment B hears a complete packet, it immediately sends back an acknowledgement, and then A will no longer have to send the remaining part of the packet train. So on an average, you can save half the active energy. So you can imagine these variants to this kind of basic idea, which sort of somewhat more complicated protocol, but they can save on the active side energy also. So that's one approach, and with, like I said, with the caveat that you do need to make sure that the that the duty cycle period is accurately known on either side. The second approach is the one which Anthony suggested, which is, hey, somehow arrange for the two parties to wake up at the same time. So in this particular case, the notion would be that we are somehow able to synchronize, and usually the way it is done is, once in a while, a packet is going to be sent out by one of the parties. That's sort of a beacon. So think of it as master node in the network, and other nodes listen for it and they synchronize to it. And what they do is they use that to adjust their clocks. Okay, so any drifts that may have built up in the clock. So what may happen is, let's say at some time t, the master sends out this packet. The nodes were up. They listened to it. They adjusted their clock, and then they are going to arrange to wake up the next time the master is going to send the clock, plus some margin for error that may have built up during that time. And then, so by doing that margining, we make sure that we wake up and again readjust the clock, and sort of things go on from that. And then otherwise, now what happens is that if the rare event happens, then at the next transmission opportunity, we know that both parties are going to be up. Again, we can budget for some clock drift, and then we go ahead and shoot out the packet. Okay, so now what is happening is, I'm paying some additional cost to do the synchronization, but now I do not have to do this excessive, my transmissions are minimal in nature. And that, besides that can have energy advantage, that can also have bandwidth advantage, because one of the things that I didn't say out here is, when A is transmitting this long train, you're also occupying spectrum, and therefore you're preventing anything else to transmit, or if it is transmitting, you're going to have collision. So this thing presents that advantage, but on the other hand, you have kind of a rigider system, okay, potentially. So it has its own sort of trade-offs, basically. Now, to make this thing happen, make this time synchronization work out, you have to make sure that there is sufficient guard band for those preambles, and whenever you're waking up, so you have to budget for the possible drift that may happen. So fundamentally, what ends up happening is, those of you who went to go to A213A, you kind of saw this, that we basically have the uncertainty in knowledge of time directly translates into how much guard band you are going to be using, and therefore increased power and increased spectrum usage. And the fundamental limitation in many systems when it comes to duty cycling is not the application requirement, it's actually our ability to time sync, in the sense, if we were able to have a tighter time sync, then we can reduce the guard band and we can get more efficiency. So in this particular case, it's basically saying that the amount of guard band depends upon how the clocks are drifting, that's the skew parameter, and how often we are synchronizing. If I synchronize more frequently, the clocks will drift less during that period. And if I have more stable clocks, then the skew is less, then also I'm better off. So there's a interesting sort of nexus out there. But there are applications where the duty cycling could be insanely low, okay? But they are prevented from being low because our clocks are not good enough. So, for example, a couple of years ago, there was a call out from DoD on they were looking for people to work on a sensing system which was clearly designed for Arctic. So as you know, Arctic, the ice is melting and all the countries are kind of staking out there because there are a lot of oil and other resources and stuff like that. So what these guys wanted to do apparently was they wanted to have a sensor network on the under the ocean and last for long duration of times. Okay, so they had specs like it should be able to sit there for, I think the number was 20 years if I recall right, and then upon receiving and during that time it is asleep, and upon receiving a signal from a surface ship, it wakes up and then these nodes should start sensing, and also they should come up to the surface within a matter of half an hour or something like that. And if you calculate the numbers and the amount of drift that will happen and all, it's just not possible unless you put atomic clocks down there, but then you are increasing the sleep mode power. So these are applications where very low duty cycle were possible, but from an application perspective, but it's prevented by clocks from happening. So so duty cycling is one friend, and sort of this kind of playing with the preamble or playing with packet trains is kind of an idea. More generally, this thing falls into what is called as medium access control protocols. So medium access control protocols are the protocols by which radios coordinate with each other. They share data with each other. So there are one thing which sort of emerges is that if you use a MAC protocol which is more optimized for non-short range radios, then receivers end up listening idly a lot of the time. And so what may end up happening is that optimizations that you are doing at a higher layer may not have an effect. So let's take an example. Let's say I want to send data to some select nodes in a network. So the smart thing to do there would be what is called as multicast, okay, or there's a close cousin of that diffusion. But the idea is I construct some sort of a tree and then ship the data on that tree, okay, just the minimal that is needed. A stupid way of doing things would be to use flooding. I just send the data to all the nodes, and of course you would expect flooding would do worse. So if I were to run it on a good medium access control protocol, one which is energy aware and all, you would expect to see a behavior like this. But when you actually do these things on sort of standard MAC protocols, the kind you find in Wi-Fi when it is running in this kind of a peer-to-peer mode and all, you see that your smartness at the routing level doesn't really have any effect. They all sort of consume the same thing. Your flooding, which is so blatantly inefficient, does as well as kind of the smarter routing techniques, because what's happening is that the receivers are up and listening all the time, and therefore negating all the advantages. Whereas in a MAC protocol where the receivers can be put to sleep, you begin to see these differences. So it matters how you manage the sleep state of the radio. So MAC protocols traditionally have been about coordinating radios so that their transmissions do not collide. A new burden on them now is that they also need to manage the sleep state of the radio. So you can think of the MAC protocol as like the operating system for the radio. Just like the OS decides when to put the CPU to sleep or wake it up and all, MAC protocol is deciding when to put the radio to sleep and when to wake it up, and using and the kind of ideas were those preamble things. So when it comes to conserving energy on the radio, Duty cycling is one, which we saw. So you basically try to reduce idle listening. There are other aspects that you could also do. One is to avoid collision. So anytime you have packets colliding, that generally speaking is a bad thing, because if radio A and B are both transmitting and C is supposed to listen, if transmissions collide, then that's wasted energy and also wasted bandwidth. Another one is to avoid overhearing. So if two radios are talking, then my radio should not wake up and listen. Okay, so somehow we need to avoid this thing that a radio should can falsely wake up. And then finally, keeping things simple. If I have to transmit a lot of additional control packets, signaling packets, just to get my protocol to work, again, I'm going to negate all the benefits. So over past various radio protocols and all, including the more recent ones, there are many different points of operation which have emerged. People have played with many different kind of ideas and all. I just wanted to describe to you how power management is done in some of the common wireless standards which are out there. And the most common one, of course, is Wi-Fi 802.11. And the way Wi-Fi works is fundamentally deep down, they have what kind of like a Ethernet type way of organizing communications called carrier sense multiple access with collision avoidance. And this is kind of the foundation on top of which rest of 802.11 Wi-Fi infrastructure is built. And in particular, on top of it, they provide the more commonly used mode of operation that we use, which is called asynchronous, where the idea is that when a node seeks to transmit, and nodes do not coordinate. Okay, they transmit packets whenever they feel like, but they take some clever preventions. And then there is another mode of operation which is supported nowadays in some, but it's not always very prevalent, where you actually do a little bit of synchronization so that you avoid the possibility of collision. So what happens in the primary mode, which is kind of on the right hand side, is the following: that the nodes, whenever they seek to transmit, whenever a node has to transmit, what it does is it looks at the channel, sees if anyone is transmitting. It does so for a little bit of time, which is called DIFS. If it sees no one is transmitting, then it goes ahead and transmits the data. And then after it sent the packet, it is going to wait again for some period of time. Meanwhile, any other node, if it wishes to transmit and then it sees the channel is busy, it is going to wait until the channel again becomes free, and then kind of the whole process repeats. And if it turns out that the channel is busy, there is a random back off which is happening. So all of this is kind of under the hood details, which is sort of less important. But the point is, in this kind of infrastructure, there is no possibility of sleeping. Remember, I mentioned that how receivers, we need to let the receiver sleep. There's very little ability to do that because the receiver has to passively listen for an arriving message. It doesn't work very nicely. So there is this PCF mode of operation, and the way it works in PCF mode of operation is that time is divided into cycles. So it's like a gigantic period. At the beginning of the period, some time is set aside for traffic which is synchronous, which is going to be periodic. And then the remainder of this thing is set aside for that kind of asynchronous traffic that I just mentioned. So what these things do is they basically now start to give a possibility that a node could go to sleep, because if it is doing some sort of a very periodic traffic, it will wake up only during its assigned times when it is actually expecting a packet, and then otherwise go to sleep. So sleep management begins to come through this. So the basic idea in power management then is nodes which are in Wi-Fi is nodes which are in power management mode, they sleep, and meanwhile packets for them are buffered. So if it is an access point kind of a system, access point buffers the packet, and then nodes are synchronized using that PCF that I described. They wake up and they say, is there a packet for me? So the way it works is, going back out here, in this periodic mode, every so often the base station advertises, I have packets waiting for node I, J, and K. So it sends out kind of a table which is basically listing which nodes that have packet arrived and are waiting there. So what is called traffic indication map. And what the nodes do is they arrange to wake up at that periodic time. They look for this TIM packet, and if the TIM packet says there is a packet for them, then the nodes stay up. So essentially, buffering happening at the access point. So earlier on, some lectures ago, I had described how wake on wireless schemes and all work with kind of Apple's scheme of proxy sleep and stuff like that. They all kind of build upon this basic idea that access point can buffer packets. Your mobile device or wireless device is going to wake up on some periodic basis, look for this traffic indication map, which tells us whether there is traffic for it. If so, it stays up until, so if so, I think the way it works is it tells the base station, hey, I am up, and then the base station pushes the traffic at it. So that's what's happening. This thing is very easy to do when you're operating in the synchronous mode, because there is a fixed time when you can wake up. When you're operating in the distributed mode or asynchronous mode, this becomes trickier. So power management in 8.11 has always been a bit tricky, but it's only in very recent times that we have begun to see this penetrating. So underlying all of this, to make this synchronization happen and all, 8.11 actually has time synchronization. So nodes do need to be time synchronized so that they can know when to wake up and all. And the strategy is very simple. Base station basically sends out a packet saying time is X. All the clients just adopt it and then arrange to wake up at the next expected periodic time. So that's kind of the basic strategy on power management in 8.11. Now 8.11 power management, 8.11 was never designed for low power systems and all, so it kind of got dragged into it. And so power management took a long time to kind of stabilize and all. Other radio standards, the newer things which came later, they often targeted explicitly lower power mode. So a good one is 8.15.4, and there are some different variants of it which differ in what physical layer you are using, but common to all of them is a common MAC protocol. And this is the radio which you now find used in like smart home sensors, energy management, those kind of things. Like last time when I was talking about meters talking to appliances and all this, or like the Philips Hue light, all these kind of things, they're all using this Zigbee radio as it is called. So this is probably the closest as it gets to right now for the radio standard for Internet of Things type systems, if you may. So it provides a physical layer. I've listed two of them. There's a more recent third one also, which uses kind of a newer type of radio, ultra wideband radio. They have a common MAC protocol, and then on top of it, there's something called Zigbee, which is a set of routing protocols and all. And then actually, in parallel to this, the Internet Task Force has defined something called IPv6 low-pan. So it's basically the TCP/IP stack which sits on top of this. So there's a whole rich ecosystem out here. So these devices can be on the internet, stuff like that. And at the same time, this MAC protocol was designed for low power operation. So this is an example of one of the first standards which explicitly targeted short range radio range in an entire network. So Bluetooth was around before that, but Bluetooth largely was limited to as a wire replacement. This was more of a network. So there are many of these 15.4 radios around. This is an example of a chip, somewhat older chip from TI. But basically, it operates in the same band as our Wi-Fi stuff does. Many channels, those channels are 3 megahertz wide, and then there are 16 channels, and kind of the MAC protocol network selects and operates in one of those. The main thing is that the way it does things is, again, having a frame structure. So it's a very deterministic time synchronized frame, at the beginning of which there is some control information, and then nodes wake up only when there is going to be traffic for them. And it had direct support for low power in the system. So I'm going to jump to that. So what happens is that there is this super frame, as it is called, which is that period, in which coordinator of the network, kind of a master node, what it does is it advertises what the schedule is. So essentially it is controlling how often the nodes get to sleep, and what it describes within that is in what order, where would the data for a node occur, and also node gets all this information, and then it can go to sleep and just wake up at the time when there is data for it. So devices in this case can sleep for long periods of time. So what's happening is, let me see if I have a good picture. Yeah. So what is happening out here is the following: that there is a large super frame consisting of what are called as, well, you can think of as tinier frames, and the whole schedule is advertised for the whole super frame, and then within each one of these intervals, since you know when to expect the packet for you, or when is it your turn to transmit or receive, nodes basically just wake up accordingly. And then finally what they do is, there is a set of time which I think is this creamish color area, which is kind of a free for all. So any node which doesn't participate in this reservation and all can wake up, transmit the packets, and also this looks like the collision contention based mechanism. So what ZigBee lets you do is, you can have devices which are really very tiny power, and by listening to the schedule they wake up just at the right time. So for example, some of the products out there now are just wall switches. They can come with a little battery, you slap them on the wall, they're meant for controlling your lights, and their claimed lifetime is like a decade or something. Okay, so they can last for a long time. To the extent, there are some products out there where the rocking motion of the switch itself gives them the energy which they use to actually do the radio transmission. Okay, so point is, they can be insanely low in power because they're basically not up listening all the time. They basically participate just. They get to know what is happening. Yeah.
Not directly relevant, but if we have these things that can get power from movement, why aren't they in like smartphones and smartwatches already?
Okay, good question. I'm going to offer that as a homework problem. But what do you think? Okay. So why are they not?
Way
Huh?
too low.
Huh?
Power is way too low.
Why is the power way too low? Actually, that reminds me, I think one of the papers I'll offer is a good paper out of Georgia Tech where they actually analyze it. How much power would it need for, like, let's say, you know how wearable sensors and all are kind of in the vogue. So they kind of did some analysis on that. Okay, the point is, ultimately, it's all about you're converting motion energy into electricity, right? So you need to have adequate kinetic energy, and it's very hard to have adequate kinetic energy. Any of you ever have those emergency flashlights which are meant for earthquake thing and all? Okay, you have to shake them a lot before you get enough light. Okay, so now think about how much motion your phone actually gets. Not much. Okay. So short answer. Now, having said that, there are some products out there or projects, and also, like, for example, some years ago MIT made a lot of splash by, so they had basically shoes where they had sensors. So this was some sort of you can imagine for like gait monitoring and stuff like that, and they were able to scavenge, if I recall right, a milliwatt average. A milliwatt average is actually pretty decent. Okay, you can do a lot with a milliwatt. You can sense, you can transmit, things like that. So they were using that a lot. So it was kind of, they called it a smart shoe basically. Okay, so that's what's happening. So you could in some cases. The other thing is these watches. They're all, if going back forever. Okay, I mean, I remember from my childhood days, my dad had this so-called automatic watch, as they used to call it, but it was basically a watch which you never had to wind, and of course those days there were no batteries, so the way it was a mechanical harvester. Okay, so it would load stuff in. Nowadays there are counterparts of that. Seiko sells these watches which again are batteryless, but they're electronic watches. So, but watches are optimized for like microwatt or nanowatt level power consumption for your mobile phone and all, not enough energy. How much power do you think our mobile phones take on an average? When they are doing LTE transmission, it's several watts. Okay, so it's pretty intense. So yeah, you're not going to be able to do that. Okay, so going back out here. So 15.4 was designed from scratch up for these lower power mode of operation. In particular, they paid a lot of attention to things like rapid startup of the radio, not letting the radio sleep all the time, so all these kind of things. They have some special modes also, something called BLE, where you can go even lower duty cycle to extend the lifetime. So essentially, so for things like light bulb and all, of course, it's a non-issue. Okay, they are plugged into the AC supply, so they have plenty of power. But for things like light switches and all, battery life does become an issue. But nice thing is, at this stage, there are chips and there are products which kind of are making use of this. So there's a lot of stuff out there. Now, having said that, that 15.4 doesn't solve the problem. As things go, 15.4 is still high power. While those light switches can last for 5 to 10 years, they don't do much. It's just a binary switch. So there have also been radio standards which have emerged, which have targeted kind of an intermediate ground, which is we still want that much lifetime, but now I would like to be able to transmit some meaningful amount of data. So first effort in this direction was actually something which is very widely used, but it's not a standard. It's something called ANT, and there's a close cousin of it called ANT++. It came out of a private company, so it's not a standard per se, but nevertheless, like I said, it's used quite a bit, and it's actually built into a lot of devices. Even like iPhone, at least the earlier versions of iPhone had it. Okay, that's how it talked to some of the like Nike's shoe sensor in the shoe that was all ANT based. So widely adopted, but not a standard. So basic thing out here is they were aiming for years of lifetime on a coin cell kind of stuff and still have a rich enough networking capability and all. So what these guys did is they operate on a purely synchronous basis. So they have a time division, multiple access. So everything is time slotted. Everyone knows when to transmit things and all. And then the very tiny packets, just 8 byte packets going out. Okay, so very tiny payloads. But within that, they optimize the hell out of it. The main thing I want to point out is for similar numbers of similar duty cycles and all. So Bluetooth would last. This is our old Bluetooth, not the newer Bluetooth. Bluetooth would last, let's say, a week. Zigbee would last a few months. Terrific. But this guy will last for years. Okay, so they kind of really optimized things in that direction. So these are sensors which are, or like, I think the right level out here is these are things like a sensor which is measuring the heart rate. So it's sending out stuff maybe once a second, a very small packet, or once every 10 seconds. So it's not what the Zigbee BLE mode, this stuff was targeted at, because that was once in a blue moon things being sent out. Here you still have stuff going out reasonably at a reasonable rate, but still small amounts of data. So this is another example where as the message period is changing, the lifetime. So like if you're sending messages at once every 2 seconds, that's still a very reasonable rate to send. And goes up to like 4 years. Okay, whereas BLE and Bluetooth are stuck in days and weeks kind of thing. So ANT became quite successful, was getting a lot of adoption, and I guess meanwhile, but the adoption here was in the specialized devices like the chest bells and all. And like I said, some phones had it. Sony's Android phones had ANT. iPhone, like I said, had ANT. So there were some phones which had ANT, but it was not a standard. So and it supported various kind of networking topologies and stuff like that. I'm not going to go over it; they're kind of boring. What happened in recent years is that led Bluetooth to introduce its own counterpart to ANT, which is almost as good as ANT, not exactly, but achieves much of those goals, and the fact that it's called Bluetooth and built into all the devices basically gives it a penetration. So ANT basically at this stage essentially disappears. BLE started in iPhone like 3 years ago or so, and now more recent Android phones have it too, and I think we're just seeing increasing penetration. Similar concept in terms of what ANT was aiming at, very low duty cycle. In particular, unlike classical Bluetooth, where for two nodes to talk, they had to synchronize, do some handshaking and all. Here, none of that is needed. You wake up, transmit. You can have very low duty cycles of like 1 in 50 or things like that. So 1% to 2% duty cycle and last for years. So that's kind of the notion out here. A lot of those other details kind of don't really matter, but the main point is that it lets things sleep very, very aggressively. So variables and chest bells and these kind of things and all the numbers, I guess for low data rate applications, they can go, these things can go quite a bit. I'm sure you guys would have seen these tags which have come out, the Bluetooth tags, which are, you attach it to your luggage and all, and you can locate it months later and all. They're all using BTLE because what these tags do is they transmit, hello, I'm here, every few seconds. Or like iBeacons from Apple, same thing. They last for months and years basically, because all they're doing is they're transmitting things at a relatively low duty cycle, once a second, once every few seconds, on a coin cell. They can last forever. So that's kind of probably the latest of the low energy standards which are there, and I'm sure things will keep coming. Okay, but at this stage, these things represent kind of the state of affairs. Now, meanwhile, what has happened is on the academic front, there's some other interesting ideas which have come to the fore, and I want to touch upon just a couple of them. So almost all MAC protocols, including all the standards that I have talked about, they are what are called as sender-initiated protocols. Kind of the idea is, if I need to send you something, I'm going to initiate the communication. But you could easily imagine a counterpart, which is you can poll me and say, do I have something to send to you? Okay, so instead of me initiating the act of communication, you initiate it, and it turns out that that ends up having some advantages from a power perspective. So that's one insight. The other insight, and as you'll see in the next few slides, is what happens when two packets collide. So let's say both A and B are sending packets to C. So normal notion in networking is that if the transmission time of A and the transmission time of duration of B, if they overlap, both packets are trashed. Is that always the case? Any thoughts on that? So is packet collision always something which is going to be a bad thing? So the server assembly, so A and B are sending two packets to transmit two packets at the same time. Can you think of a condition under which C, which is listening to both, can still receive the packet? Exactly the same packet and at exactly the same time, right? I mean, these two conditions, they have to be identical in content and they have to overlap right down to the bit level timing. If we can do that, then as far as C is concerned, they are identical. So again, clock, time sync, that plays an important role out here. But if you can arrange this thing, then that can work. And this turns out to be actually quite beneficial. So at the risk of preempting my future slides, so let's imagine A needs to send a packet to a faraway node. So a very common strategy is A sends the packet to all the neighbors. And those, or let's imagine I'm flooding packets. Okay, so I want a packet to go out to all the nodes in the network. The strategy maybe I'll give to my neighbors. Those neighbors are going to retransmit, and the two hop away neighbors will receive it, and so on and so forth. Now the problem is normally this flooding becomes very problematic because when two of my neighbors transmit, they risk collision. But since they are actually transmitting the identical packet, if we can arrange them to be perfectly synchronous, then I do not run into this collision problem. So if I could somehow have right down to sub-bit level time synchronization, I could send out identical packets and still be okay. Or I could be a little bit smarter also. I could have let some fields of the packet collide and the others not, and kind of do something around it. So I could do that. So that's one condition, that packets are identical and totally synchronized. Can you think of some other condition where packets can collide and I can still recover? So again, you are receiving overlap of two packets. Under what condition can you recover? Okay, can you recover anything? So if I'm getting A plus B, can you recover anything somehow? Okay, yeah, go ahead. Not quite. What if I knew A somehow? Right, so if I'm getting A plus B and I knew A, then I can subtract A out of A plus B and I can recover B. Okay, now not quite, but we can code packets in a certain way so that when packets partially overlap, I can still kind of end up recovering. So there have been papers around these ideas where now you have radios which basically can let packets collide and still recover them, okay, under some conditions with certain constraints like these. But the first idea, which is if I have basically identical packets, if they're perfectly synchronized in time, then there is no collision happening. So it turns out that idea got used, and there have been a few MAC protocols which are not standard, but probably may become someday, or someday be part of the MAC standard. So this concept of sender, so normally it's communication is sender initiated. Sender has a packet to send, it sends D to packet, and the receiver gets it. Okay, but we saw that whole earlier scheme of polling and all, where what happens is I have the sender sends a long preamble, which is sized so that it is longer than the polling period, and then it sends the packet. So this, by the way, is called low power listening. Okay, so that's there. But so this is the classical stuff. But with receiver initiated MAC, kind of we do a role reversal. So the idea is that sender is listening, the receiver sends a probe. Receiver says, do you have something to send? The sender gets the probe, and if the sender has something to send, it sends the data. Okay, so that's kind of the basic concept out here. And it turns out that this role reversal offers certain advantages. So firstly, there are some advantages having to do with network topology and all, okay? But the main thing is we avoid the long preamble now. Okay, so what is happening now is, remember with the sender initiated stuff, with this rare event scenario, what was happening was that the sender started sending and sent a long preamble in the hope so that the receiver was guaranteed to wake up. By doing it receiver initiated, we eliminate that. So when the rare event happens, we do nothing. But the receiver, at the next time it wakes up, is going to check with us. Do you have something to send? So it's going to send out the probe. So we eliminate the long preamble, and we can support, therefore, even lower duty cycle than otherwise. So that's kind of the basic concept. And around this idea, there have been a whole bunch of sort of papers published kind of 4 or 5 years ago. But there are challenges as well. Probe is more expensive. So now what is happening is I'm actually sending a packet. The receiver actually has to send a packet every time it wakes up. Whereas previously, the receiver just had to listen. Passive listening is certainly somewhat cheaper, even in short-range radios, than transmitting. The other thing is, when you're actually sending the probe, you're actually going to occupy the channel. So there's going to be wastage of bandwidth. So there are issues coming up. But if we could somehow design it, it carries some advantages. So the main thing out here is the following: that what you're trying to optimize is that could we prevent, could we could we optimize the sleep time? So in the sender initiated one, where the receiver, whenever it wakes up, says, looks at the channel, is there something for me? The problem also happens is if that probing, is there something on the channel? If it is done like the way you were describing, which is just look for some trend, some noise, some signal on the channel, then you may even noise, any transmission by someone else may wake you up. Okay, so we want to avoid that situation. So with receiver initiated, that problem is eliminated. There are no spurious wake-ups because it's actually a genuine probe. So the way it works out now is the following. So imagine a network where one has to send a packet. So what happens is 2 sends a probe to 1. So 2 is a neighbor of 1. 2 sends a probe. 1 sends the data. So now 2 has the data. What 2 does is it now is listening. At some stage, 3 sends a probe, which is a neighbor of 2. So at this stage, 3 sends a probe and 3 gets the data. So now 3 also has the data. So now 2 and 3 have the data. At some stage, 4 sends a probe. 4 is a neighbor of 2, and therefore 4 gets the data. So now at this stage, 1, 2, 3, and 4 have the data, and we are trying to flood. So now 5 sends a probe. Well, when 5 sends a probe, what happens is 5's probe is heard by 2, 3, and 4. They're all going to respond. They're all going to send the data, and node 5 in a normal course is going to see a collision. But if we could do if we could do the idea that I was describing, then we can eliminate this thing. Okay, so there's a couple of ways you can do it. One is we can make sure that one of the node has very high power. Okay, but the main thing is if we can do perfect synchronization, then I can eliminate this problem. Okay, so let me just jump through. So what is happening now at this stage is there are 2 transmitters that are sending packets, but these packets are absolutely identical and absolutely aligned in time, and as a result, the receiver actually gets the packet as opposed to the packet getting crashed. So the key thing is should be identical and it should be very tightly time synchronized. So in particular, I'm going to skip some slides out here. In particular, right down to, so if you look at these things, you're basically looking at microsecond level times and all. These things are, these radios are not terribly high speed, but the bits are still some, let's say, order of microsecond kind of thing. So you need to get your radios aligned down to that level of time synchronization. But if you can do it, then the identical packets are, even when they collide, are going to basically not cause any problem. So it turns out that you can actually do this stuff with many of the standard radios. So it's not like you use the same radios which are being used on 15.4, but you just operate them differently in this time synced mode, and then you can make this magic happen. So this protocol called AMAC, which was out of Berkeley, basically achieved this thing. It basically it basically provides that synchronization. And then what happens is, if let's say for whatever reason things went wrong, maybe the synchronization was not great and all, then as a backup strategy, they have a contention resolution. So then in that case, what happens is this receiver will see that there is a collision. It's going to see some energy coming in. It will suspect a collision. So now what it will do is it will send another probe saying, you know, a collision happened, and can only one of you transmit. And at that point, one of these nodes is going to defer. The other will actually send the packet, and packet will come through. So the idea is, the primary strategy is don't do any collision avoidance or anything like that. Let people transmit and have them be synchronized, perfectly synchronized, so that the packet comes through. If things fail, then you pay some additional penalty. So if your synchronization is good enough, you will most of the time operate very nicely. Question? This collision, this part? Yeah. So what it will do is it will basically say, do a random back off. So what these guys will do is they will toss a coin, and then with a very low probability, one of them basically will transmit. That's one. the other these are classical techniques. Another one is that the probability with which a node will transmit will depend upon how small its ID is. Okay, so a node with a higher ID will have a lower probability of transmission. So you stochastically create a situation where it doesn't happen. Now, that's one possibility. Another possibility is that maybe from prior communication, this guy actually does know the IDs. And therefore, it can say, node I, you transmit. Okay, so there are different ways of kind of resolving that potential.
Yes, you are right. Yes, you got the point, but there is a complex state when these two senders try to communicate to this receiver, and another two senders try to communicate from another receiver. And now this receiver say something, but
yeah, you're right. So the part I'm leaving out here is that actually these probes that you send out also act as telling other nodes to shut up. So they kind of play two roles. Okay, it's basically querying, do you have something to send to me? And it's also telling the others, do not send anything. So that's called the hidden terminal problem, and they basically, actually it turns out they mitigate it more. So this actually is a pretty nicely done protocol. It turns out, I'm going to skip some slides now to jump on to the next one, but it ends up doing actually, it ends up doing actually quite well. Okay, I'm going to skip these slides. These are just performance numbers. The main thing out here is that its main limitation is that you do need this time synchronization, and you need this very deterministic timing. Remember, we are asking for packets to be transmitted at exactly the same time. Okay, so which basically means when a node receives a probe, it is going to bounce back the packet in a very deterministic time after the probe. And that requires a very tight operating system and a very tight time synchronization. Okay, so all of these need to be done, but it turns out what these guys showed is that they could do it. They need synchronization to half a bit time or half a symbol time. So they were able to kind of achieve that. It turns out in their particular case, they basically had a half a microsecond requirement, and they were able to achieve it. Okay, so that was one. Second one, there is, took this step further, and they basically combined network flooding with time synchronization, and kind of the idea. So this was a bit more recent work after AMAC, and kind of similar concept. So idea out here is I have some node which wishes to flood the network, and what I want to do now is in this particular case I send things out so there's no probe and all out here. It's just very rapid flooding. So what is happening is that transmitters send out packets synchronized at the same time. It's the same concept. As long as they are able to transmit things to half a microsecond, we are good to go. So there's a very rapid flooding which happens in this particular case. Initiator sends the packet. First time around, all the one-hop neighbors get it. Second time around, they all transmit. All the one-hop neighbors transmit, but their packets are perfectly colliding. So all the second-hop neighbors get it, and so on and so forth. So in timeline-wise, it kind of looks like the following. First transmitter transmits, the receiver gets it. Next time around, this receiver transmits. Both the original guy gets it, and the next guy gets it. But since these packets are perfectly aligned, nothing bad happens. Okay, so that's kind of the concept out here. Performance-wise, they kind of win out significantly. So the main thing is, if they are synchronized to around half a microsecond, then they are able to basically get very good performance. In their particular case, they showed that they were able to achieve 0.4 microsecond in an 8-hop network, which is very impressive. So main conclusions out of this is the following. Radios are a big energy consumer in the tinier devices, even for cell phone type stuff and all. Normally our protocols were designed for transmission being kind of the bottleneck, but since reception is often the bottleneck, trying to optimize for that. And the main concepts that we see, duty cycling is one, okay, and how you can adapt the duty cycle. The other is letting the transmitter send out a long packet chain or a long preamble, and the receiver waking up and sampling the channel is called LPL, or so it's basically sample. The preamble sampling is another term which is used for it. Then the third concept we saw is this receiver initiated, which has some advantages. And finally, this notion that packet collisions can be managed. If packets are very tightly time synchronized, then their collision we can still recover from the collision and done that. The problem with these latter techniques is that there's a time in the network where nothing else can happen because you're operating it in a very rigid way. So you lose some in flexibility, but you gain in other ways. So these probably represents kind of at this stage kind of the latest ideas which are floating around. Like I said, these things are not in use. These latter 2-3 concepts are not actually in used in any of the standards, but someday they might, because their potential is kind of pretty good. What, on the other hand, 15.4 and Bluetooth LE, they all are based around the concept of having a frame, having some sort of 15.4 and Wi-Fi are based around having a frame and a schedule, and Bluetooth LE is based around the concept of basically duty cycling coupled with the packets coming through. So at this stage, we can get down to 1 to 2% duty cycling with commercial radios while achieving few kilobits of data rate. If you need to go down to, let's say, 0.1% duty cycle or those kind of things, you basically have to use some of these other protocols which are still in the research stage. Some of the applications permit or have requirements which are maybe 0.01% duty cycle, and we don't know how to achieve them because at some stage clock becomes kind of a bottleneck. But just to throw out kind of power requirements that exist across the board. So things like, can I have a sensor which can last for a decade and be able to respond to an event within an order of second or so. So events happen once a month maybe. When the event happens, you have to detect it, communicate it, all within a second. And by the way, on a tiny volume, you have to last for 10 years. Okay, that's kind of a challenge. Again, lots of things have to align for that. Another one is, and there was a talk in EE some time ago, can I have, let's say, an ECG sensor, multiple electrodes and all, or a medical sensor of some form, or like my heart, whatever, heart rate thing and all, which can last for some meaningful amount of time, kind of numbers which we quoted. Can it last for 6 weeks? Can it last for 6 months? Okay, right now, like the Apple Watch, it's 20 hours, okay? And they go through a lot of, I mean, there's obviously a lot more than just sensing going on, but the sensors are kind of are a big power consumer there. The preamble in the radio, there's a concept that US DoD has often talked about, which is, so why do we have preamble in the radio? I mentioned that earlier, but just see. So why do we transmit that preamble before the packet? For the signal to stabilize, yes.
Did you say something to make sure the frequencies match?
Frequency match, right? So there are all these things, right? We know when they're starting. Can I eliminate the preamble? What would it take? No, can I eliminate the preamble? So imagine if everyone had atomic clocks, and we agreed that we are going to exchange, two nodes agreed they're going to exchange packet at time t. They wake up at time t and they squirt the bits out, no preamble needed. Because we had high quality clocks, I can eliminate that. So in fact, motivated by this, why the US DoD invested quite a bit in these chip scale atomic clocks. So kind of the idea is that I can entirely eliminate the notion of preamble. I can have radios which basically just wake up and send the payload. no preamble needed, no synchronization needed and all, okay. So we can decide like, okay, you know, every minute, on the minute, according to UTC, the two of us will talk. And if our clocks are really, really tightly synchronized, then every minute at the UTC, I'm going to just send the bits, nothing else needed. Okay, we just squirt them out. So these kind of concepts are floating around. So there's a nice mix out here of protocols, timing requirements, what the real-time operating systems and all are capable of, like in this thing where they had to turn around after a probe, I had to send a reply back in a very deterministic fashion. All of these constraints kind of come into play. So that's kind of one realm of thing which is happening. The other part is sheerly making radios more efficient. I mean, we are reaching a stage where it's after we have done all this duty cycling and all, we begin to reach a stage where again our amplifier power and all those things become an issue. So every little whatever nanojoules we want to kind of squeeze out of that. And the other idea which we saw in one of the presentations was the EchoNet stuff, where maybe our radios don't need to be powered up. Maybe they can operate by scavenging energy, which is shown at so basically grab energy from the RF environment and whatnot. So those are some of the other concepts which are floating around. Okay, so anyway, I'm going to stop out here.